Okay. I don't think that you can quite hear the heater, so I'm just gonna roll along with it and we'll see what happens. The squeaking of my chair is killing me. Hello, dumpster divers. Welcome back to finally another Minecraft Diaries Redesign speed paint, where today we are working on one of my favorite villains of all time and a character that truly needs no introduction, Zane Ro'meave. If you watched at least the intro to my last video that I uploaded, which is very fun and silly if I do say so myself, then you may or may not have gotten to see just a little sneak peek of what this final design looks like. But it has been far too long, and for that I apologize. However, I come to you now with this brand new, hopefully time-accurate Zane Ro'meave redesign. And perfect timing too, seeing as how Afmao is posting more roleplay content.
Mermaid Tales, my beloved!
I do just want to give a tiny disclaimer though before I fully dive in that I have literally been sitting on this design for over a year, because if I'm anything, it's one, unreliable, and B, inconsistent. So if this video is a little bit more off and jumbled than my Afmao one, again, I do apologize. But with that out of the way, let's start talking about my Zane redesign and explain some of the choices that I've made in a way that will hopefully make sense. Beginning with his concept sketch, which is something I didn't really do for Afmao, only because her redesign was so much more straightforward to me. But for Zane, the more research I would do and the more information I would find, the more that the clothes would change depending on the rank that I was looking at. And at that point, his design in my head would change so constantly. It reached a point where I needed to look at what I had saved, needed to look at his character in depth, and just kind of go from there. Thus, the concept sketch was born. All this to say, of course, his original designs in Minecraft Diaries will always be iconic. Zane Ro'meave, I love you. But I really wanted to lean into that high priest aspect of his character, so here I'm really just kind of deciding on the shape of the clothes and playing around with what colors look best where. Honestly, I drew a lot of inspiration from a plethora of different articles I was able to find on medieval priests, which you can probably see somewhere on your screen, and using those was such a huge help to visualize the look that I was trying to envision for Zane in the first place, seeing as how priests were known to wear very long and elegant articles of clothing, especially if one was of a high ranking, such as a bishop or a pope or even a high priest. Zane, being the High Priest of Okassis on top of being the second son in line for what is basically a kingdom, technically making him a prince, I wanted to make it clear that he was in some kind of higher position of power or wealth by giving him just a few more layers of clothing with some extra details and embroidery, much more than your typical church priest would have worn. Let's break this down layer by layer, and disclaimer again, if I get any information wrong, I am so sorry. Like I said, it has been over a year since I have started and finished this, so some of the information that I have saved might be in the wrong order or incorrect overall, and if that is the case, let me know, and I'll see what I can do to fix it. That being said, let's start with the very bottom layer, called the alb. It stems from a long white tunic that was commonly worn by ancient Greeks and Romans and was then retained by the Christian clergy starting in/around the early centuries of the Common Era or 1 AD. However, it wasn't until the beginning of the 5th century that the alb became a standard part of priestly attire. The alb was primarily made of a white linen, or if the church had a little bit more wealth to spare in the Middle Ages, they could use a finer fabric such as silk or velvet, and the alb was the foundation of the priest's clothing. It always went on before anything else. It was primarily a symbol of spiritual purity and was meant to remove any negative emotion from man. Sometime in the 10th century, the alb began to be decorated with ornamental embroideries on the hems and cuffs, as well as rectangular patches called, and excuse my pronunciation, parules? Parules? Parules, I think. Or apparels, eventually being replaced with lace in the 16th century. For this alb in particular, I envisioned it being more of a linen fabric, keeping a little bit more to the plain side as to keep its symbolic purity. Moving along to the second layer, that is called the dalmatic, or in this case, the pontifical dalmatic, since it is worn above the alb and below the chasuble, which will be talked about shortly, but for now, the dalmatic. It was first worn in the Roman world sometime in the 3rd or 4th century, and it is a long, loose outer garment typically with slits on either side and consists of wider sleeves. The dalmatic could also be heavily decorated with colorful tapestries and ecclesiastical patterns, and they were worn almost exclusively by Romans, especially of those in the upper class. At some point, one needed explicit permission from the Pope to even wear a dalmatic. However, it wasn't until around the 9th century that it was adopted almost entirely for deacons and bishops in Western Europe. Because dalmatics were often made of silk, I went ahead and made Zane's a little bit closer to a brocade fabric, which is an extremely rich shuttle-woven fabric predominantly put together with colored silk or threads of silver and gold, often worn by the wealthiest of people and Christian subjects. Now, lucky for me, Zane checks off pretty much both of those boxes because A, he's a high priest, and B, he's kind of a prince. Plus, dalmatics can in fact be made of brocades, and so it ends up working out pretty perfectly. Next layer, the chasuble. Once again being influenced by the Greeks, this is a sleeveless outer vestment, kind of like a poncho, that was worn as early as the 4th century by most common people. However, somewhere between, I think, the 5th and the 6th century, they were developed into more ecclesiastical vestments and were really only then worn by high angelic priests and those of a high ranking. Chasubles at that time were very, very long, usually below the ankles, and required assistance when moving, which was very inconvenient since they were commonly worn during times of travel. It wasn't until about the 13th century that chasubles began to be altered to much more of how they look in this design, so that priests could move more easily on their own. They were originally made up of wool and linen, and then switched to silk, and then back to heavy-duty fabrics because of how often they were worn during travels. And since Zane is almost constantly seen traveling, especially during Season 1 of Minecraft Diaries, I felt that the altered version was the more appropriate style to go with for this redesign. As for the fabric itself, I wanted to give his chasuble more of a velvety texture to not only give him more of a gothic priest look that I fear was only fitting in this case. I mean, just look at him. But to also sprinkle in more of that royalty aspect of his character, since velvet was a fabric that had become a very coveted symbol of wealth and high ranking due to how costly it was to produce. During the 8th century, chasubles got more and more elaborate with their details over time. However, for Zane, I kept his chasuble just a little bit more on the plain side, but I did add a few symbols of Lady Irene as opposed to a cross, just for a little bit of contrast. Also, at some point, definitely while I was finalizing this design, I ended up making that center part with all of that Irene embroider a separate article of clothing, like an overlay. I know I got that inspiration from a couple of images that I was looking at, but upon further review, that center part is actually supposed to be a physical part of the chasuble and not just an overlay. So, because I am too lazy to redo this whole piece, at least for right now, we're just gonna pretend that it's a physical part and not just an overlay. But that is enough about the chasuble. Let's move along to the stole. The stole are the long scarf-looking bits that are peeking out under the dalmatic, and they were worn as signs of priestly authority. They would often widen out at the ends, keeping flat under the tunics that were worn above them. The stole was also a sign that a priest was officially ordained to perform any religious rites, such as weddings or funerals, and in this case, I can only assume that within Minecraft Diaries, Zane is, in fact, officially ordained, only because, again, smack dab in the middle of Minecraft Diaries Season 1, he is the one to officiate Logan and Donna's wedding, so to me, stole is really a no-brainer to add, especially since it is seen on almost every single priest, regardless of their rank. Up next, we've got the actual scarf that sits around his neck. That is called the amice. It was used to cover up any signs of the priest's street clothes, if you will, and it kind of starts out as this piece that will sit over your head like a hood, and it's got ties that will wrap around the waist, and then will be lowered down around the neck after all of the other garments have been added. Now, it is to my understanding that the actual origins of the amice are almost entirely unknown date-wise, but there are some theories that state that it was first worn to prevent any of the other garments from being covered in sweat, or to simply cover and protect the throat. Regardless of its true origins, I added the Amis to his redesign not only because is it a historically accurate piece, but because Zane is almost always seen wearing a mask. Speaking of, you'll probably notice at some point in time that I do start to make another variant of this design that does include a mask, because is he truly Zane Ro'meave without it? Historically speaking, masks have been around for centuries in all different kinds of styles. But when it comes to medieval face masks, one that was worn most frequently, aside from the iconic Plague Doctor mask, we've all seen him during Halloween, was a facial covering called the barb. Barb, silly enough, stemmed from the French word of beard, and they were most popular in the late Middle Ages and the early Renaissance. Barbs were usually worn by women and could be worn in a few different ways, and they all typically had a status connection to their style, such as a mourning style or simply for being a nun. Now, at least from the research that I have done, I cannot seem to find solid evidence that men also wore barbs. However, there is a statue on the York Minster in North Yorkshire, England, that appears to depict a man wearing a face mask. It is inferred that the man was wearing a mask due to how cold it may have been. However, I took that tiny sliver of proof and I ran with it. Now, the mask that I gave Zane isn't 100% a barb, since usually they hung below the nose and covered the lower half of the face as well as just below the neck. But I didn't really want to clutter the chest area too much, so I just gave him a little bit more of a form-fitting mask, much like what he is usually depicted wearing. Now finally, the pectoral cross. Worn as early as the year 461 by both members of the church and those outside, this is a cross worn on a chain around the neck that hung below the heart. By the time the late Middle Ages had hit, the pectoral cross had become an indication of position worn by bishops, abbots, cardinals, and popes. And in some traditions, such as the Roman Catholic, the pectoral cross could be worn by somebody outside of those rankings if an indult, or special permission, is granted. I definitely feel like, at least in some ways, the cross could certainly contradict the faith and the symbol of Lady Irene, but who's to say for certain? Even I'm not entirely sure. Maybe the faith of Lady Irene and Christianity coexist, or maybe they're interchangeable, since there are multiple characters, Zane included, who are seen wearing crosses on their clothes. I'm not really going to think too much into it. This is Minecraft after all. So, throwing all logic out the window, I gave Zane a pectoral cross, and I certainly felt like it was a much needed element to his redesign just to give him a little bit more flair. Now finally, with all of those layers out of the way, let's cover the colors. If you watched the first redesign that I did for Aphmau, you'll know that if there was one thing I love about creating these little costumes, it is going deep and talking about the colors and their background. I will say most of Zane's colors were fairly similar to Aphmau's in the sense of like pigments, but for the sake of it, we're gonna go back through it all one more time. And because Zane's palette really only consists of like 3 colors, I'm just gonna group all of the different clothing layers together. That way I don't have to repeat myself. Starting out with all of the white. Pretty much all of the white in Zane's redesign is a pure white. Why? Well, I'll tell you. Because pure white was reserved for only the richest of people. To truly get that super bright white, your fabric had to be bleached using chemicals, time, and the power of the sun, especially if your fabric was wool, linen, or cotton. Usually fabrics would be laid out on a bleach field to sit out in the sun for about 4 to 8 weeks, and then after your fabric had achieved the correct level of white, it would then be the very expensive fabric that high status people were looking for. Pretty much every white that Zane wears would fall under the bleached fabric category somehow, not only because again is Zane technically royalty, but because it was a church requirement to have and wear pure white, due to their needing to convey innocence, purity, and holiness. Now listen, if you know Zane, you will know that he is the furthest thing from pure. And I love the irony of keeping this man in all of these symbols of purity and holiness, when we all know that he's not. And just note that this is also probably the most historically accurate part about this whole piece, because if medieval priests were anything, it was corrupt and greedy. Moving along to the second color, black. Depending on its pigment, black could be an extremely expensive color, and to get to that true deep black that was reserved for the wealthiest of people, there were a few ways to get there, all of which required multiple rounds of dye and quite a bit of time. One way you could have done this was to take a few different simple dyes such as weld, woad, and madder, and to combine those with a hefty amount of alum, or hydrated double salt. After mixing all of those together, you would have gotten a fairly decent black. Now repeat that step over and over and over again, and you would get some very expensive and very pigmented black fabric, as shown on the details for the Dalmatic and pretty much the entirety of the chasuble. Black was often seen as a symbol of humility, as it was often associated with the monastic life, or, monks and nuns, and to the unsuspecting eye, that does still ring true. But my symbolization has to do with the themes of power and, of course, evil, to represent how deceptive Zane can be. I mean, tell me we all remember what he did to Kiki. Finally, lest we not forget the beautiful accents of gold scattered throughout this redesign. Although the exact origins of goldwork are unknown, it is estimated to have begun in China during the Eastern Han Dynasty, which took place in about 25 to 220 AD. By the time the Middle Ages had rolled around, gold fabric could be created from a couple of different methods, but most of them seemed to boil down to a very similar starting point, which had begun at the thread. Gold would be hammered down into thin foil sheets, that sheet would then be cut into strips, and then those strips would be wrapped around a silk thread. Now, with an array of different techniques for gold fabric, all of which were very labor intensive, not to mention expensive, depending on the style of the fabric, it would sometimes be passed around from seamstress to seamstress in order to be completed. Out of all of the expensive fabrics, gold was most definitely among the most costly of all, once again being strictly reserved for royalty or those of a very high status. One last tiny miscellaneous thing about the Zane redesign is his hair. Hairstyles would vary from priest to priest. The most popular style was referred to as the tonsure, which is basically bald up on top and then hair all around the side, which was a practice that started in late Roman times surrounding the legend of St. Peter, who had his head shaved by those who did not believe his word. Sometime between the 5th and 8th century, priests began to adopt the hairstyle as a sign of humility and to renounce the vanities of the world. The tonsure could also vary by rank and by customs. The hair length overall definitely varied as well within different regions, having different rules, but there was one rule that I read that had specifically stated that hair could not be excessive in length due to it being a symbol of sin. And of course, after reading that, I knew I wanted to give Zane some super duper long freaking luscious locks, because one more time, Zane is a corrupt priest and an evil being overall. We all know this. Except you, Miles. I know that you know nothing about Minecraft Diaries and you're watching this anyway just to hear the sound of my voice, and just know that I'm gonna get you. And we're gonna sit down, we're gonna watch Minecraft Diaries, and you are going to learn exactly what it is that I'm talking about, because Minecraft Diaries is literally so peak you don't understand. Alright, that's pretty much all I've got left in me as far as talking goes. And at the end of all of this, I realized that, again, maybe some things were wrong, and if it truly is that big of a deal, then guess what? Oh no, I guess I'm just gonna have to redraw Zane again. Oh, please don't make me draw my favorite AFMAO character again, no! Anyway, thank you all so much for sticking with me throughout all of that bizarre historical blabbering, and if you did enjoy, please let me know in the landfill of comments down below, and perhaps leave a recommendation for which Minecraft Diaries character you think I should redesign next. With that, I will leave you all to watch the rest of this video with some very silly background music. Bye! You tell him, Iris.